I am genuinely, truly, amazingly excited to meet here Seb from Looking Glass Education. We've been in a little bit of email contact and we've worked together a little bit of recent times, but I've never met you in person. Seb, welcome to Bitcoin People.
Thank you so much for having me, Carrie. Honestly, it's such a pleasure. For people in the crowd, we've kind of been emailing back and forth and we've never spoken. And Carrie has been such a phenomenal help with the project we're working on and is a wealth of information. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Amazing. And it's been really lovely. There's just something about connecting with other Bitcoiners, but also gently moving into the space of educating others slowly over time is it's a big change of direction. I think people talk about Bitcoin changes you more than, it has an impact on you slowly over time. And that might be about your spending habits. It might be about your values. And in my case, it might be moving towards a change of career and change of direction. And I don't quite know where that's taking me. Certainly that's been true for you over time. I was going to start elsewhere, but I'd actually like to know how you came to be involved in Looking Glass or founding Looking Glass. Give me that bit of background.
I very much align with everything you've just mentioned. I think a lot of people, they jump into Bitcoin purely as an investment to start. They look at it as this thing that, hey, you know what, maybe I can make my life a little easier by making a few extra bucks. And then as they start reading about Bitcoin, they start to realize that this has far more potential at changing humanity than it does just changing your bank account number. And so I think when you start exploring Bitcoin, it starts to change how you perceive the world. And I completely understand why, from an external perspective, people think Bitcoin is a cult and Bitcoin is like this religion. And the reality is that I wouldn't go far as saying that it's a religion, but it's something that people are directing their attention and energy to because they realize the benefits that it can bring society. And so in terms of my background and how I found myself kind of down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, I would go back to, so as a teenager, I was fascinated with education, teaching, and so my background is teaching mountain biking. But I found that at the time I was earning like 18 bucks an hour, 17 bucks an hour. And I was wondering, like, how can I support a family on this? How can I get ahead in life doing a job that I love if I'm barely earning any money? And that's where I started to dive down the rabbit hole of investing. And I kind of got into real estate first, and then I started exploring the financial markets and futures and options. And then as I started exploring the financial markets and how our macroeconomic backdrop, kind of the issues we're facing today, I started to realize that we have a major problem. And that problem is our money and the amount of debt we have in the system and all of the byproducts that emerge from our current system, such as like wealth inequality and innovation suppression and so on. And so I ended up kind of first diving into gold, and gold I thought was fascinating. But again, I felt as if it didn't work as efficiently as it could in our digital world. And then that kind of led me to Bitcoin. And then from the moment I touched kind of the surface of Bitcoin, I think within about 4 months, I quit my job. And this was late in 2019, early in 2020. I quit my job and I just went deep down the rabbit hole and focused everything I could because I realized that this is something that can truly change the world for the better. And I think that it's exciting because we're at a pivotal moment in humanity.
Oh, I want to hit that pivotal moment in humanity. Let's go there. I want to keep talking about Looking Glass, but tell me about your perception of the I can't even say it properly, pivotal moment for humanity.
So I would say that when you look at money all the way throughout history, there has been predominantly, when I say predominantly, there's pretty much always been an issuer. Whether that is kind of the government or a private entity, there's been an issue of money. The problem is we've never been able to separate money from the state or money from this issuer. And so someone has immense control over the system. And this has always been the case. Now, sometimes you may get people that are incredibly passionate and they want to give back to society. And so we get long periods of prosperity. And that is amazing. But then sometimes you're going to get people in positions of power that unfortunately do not have the population's needs kind of in the forefront of their mind. And unfortunately, power kind of corrupts. And so that is where what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin is, for the first time ever in history, we have had a mechanism for separating money and state. And so by separating money and state, we've realigned our incentive structure, because all of a sudden, and this kind of, for those that are familiar with Bitcoin will understand, when you have a form of money that cannot be co-opted, as in it cannot be controlled by others, and the only way to obtain that money, it cannot be done through force, it cannot be done through military might, it can only be done through offering value. And so because of that, all of a sudden it realigns society to offering value to the collective rather than trying to extract from force. And so I think that may have been a long-winded answer to your question, but I think that the reason why we're at kind of a pivotal moment in history is because for the first time in history, we have had a way of separating money and state, separating money from the issuer. And that is absolutely incredible, because it realigns our incentive structures to giving back to society and offering value in order to achieve value ourselves.
There's a lot to unpack there. And the reason why I'm going to go in, you say it's a long-winded answer, but actually you've been incredibly concise and jammed a lot of ideas into that. And I always like to put myself in the shoes as I'm asking the questions. I like to put myself in the shoes of anyone who may be watching who is not already familiar with Bitcoin, who's not already familiar with some of these ideas. What you do beautifully in some of your writings is connect dots very well. So whereas I sometimes hear people in the Bitcoin space jump from A to W incredibly quickly, you actually go through the steps for us. So let's just dive into what you've just said. You've talked about the opportunity to separate money from state. You've moved on to talk about that realigns incentives and then values. So these are the steps I'm hearing, and I want to deep dive into each of these steps, as it were, and then how it's hope for humanity based on the separation that causes the change in incentives, values, and therefore humanity. So can we go down there, please?
Yeah. So that's a really powerful question, and I think that when it comes to money and what we just talked about, there's kind of 3 points to it which you have highlighted, which is the separating the money from state, and then how that impacts the realignment of values, and realigning kind of the incentive structure, and then finally how realigning the incentive structure impacts values. And so when it comes to money and state, it's really important to understand how our current monetary system works. And so the way our current monetary system works is that there are people that kind of govern the central bank. And so when times are tough, they have control over how much money there is, interest rates, and all of these monetary levers. And so that means that if they feel it is necessary, they can pump the economy full of money. And unfortunately, what this does is it misaligns the incentives in the system. And so if you're a company and you know that when times get tough, you're going to have this backstop, you're going to have the central bank who's going to come and pump a ton of money into the economy, that does something that is really, really powerful, but really dangerous. It means that people don't have to be fiscally responsible because they know they're going to be supported by the central bank. And on top of that, when the central bank starts pumping the economy full of money, the more money there is chasing after the same amount of goods, we start to see inflation. Mm-hmm. And as we start to see inflation, we start to see a devaluing of the currency. And so that basically means that why would you be incentivized to hold your savings in the currency if you know that the currency is losing purchasing power? Mm-hmm. Well, you wouldn't. And so instead, you're incentivized to pump all your money into assets. And so this now is what creates that wealth inequality. We start seeing the lower class who hold currency start to lose their purchasing power, and they don't understand why. Now the upper class, they're pumping all of their capital into assets, so asset prices become more and more and more unobtainable. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of the issue that we currently face. And so if you have a system where you're able to separate money from state, suddenly we're able to create and realign kind of the incentive structure. And so think about this for a second. So if you were to separate money from state, all of a sudden, if you have something with, say, a fixed monetary supply that cannot be altered and it cannot be co-opted, that means that, one, the only way to obtain money is to offer value back to society, because you cannot just print money out of the printer. You have to offer value. So that means government has to offer value back to its societal members, its populace. But two, as a business, in order to, again, be viable, you have to offer value. And so what that means is businesses become fiscally responsible. They don't gamble knowing that they've got this backstop that is the central bank. And governments, again, try to do what is best for the populace because they don't have a printer that allows them to continue operating no matter what. And so that gets to the values. All of a sudden, these businesses have to instill quality and they have to have integrity. They have to have quality values, because otherwise they will break down. And it's the same with government. They have to be able to offer value to society, because otherwise they will break down and they will not have support from their populace. Hopefully that answered your question.
It absolutely answers the question, and it leads to more questions. So fundamentally what I'm hearing, if I'm summarizing that, is that or the big takeaway that I take from that is that one of the primary values that changes is this issue of providing value, being financially responsible, being able to save because my purchasing power increases over time. We didn't quite get into that, but with Bitcoin, but certainly that's the corollary, as it were. I'd like to explore a little bit more about values of society. And so those are some of the values that start to change at the surface. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how you envision how that dominoes into family life.
For sure. Well, so the first thing I would say is, when you look at, if we take a step back and we move back 5,000 years. 5,000 years ago, before kind of the adoption of money, what happened is we had what was called the human economy. Now, the human economy, if we were in our small little hunter-gatherer tribe, we would get kicked out or banished from that tribe if we did not offer value. And so it was of kind of like moral and it was kind of moral and safety importance to kind of offer value back to society. And so the exchange of value was done because not only was it for the betterment of society, it was for the betterment and safety of ourselves. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, the moment money came about, it changed that incentive structure. All of a sudden, it was not about doing what is best for society because it's going to help society flourish, but it is about how can I extract from this exchange the best deal that I can. And so money, because obviously everything now becomes an exchange of sorts, it is about, if I am interacting with you and you are selling me something, I want to get it for the cheapest I can possibly get it for. Or if I'm selling something to you, I want to try and get as much money from you as possible. And so it's kind of an extractive system. And the extractive system kind of goes against our natural willingness and desire to want to help in society. And so this kind of touches on quickly those values for a second, which is when you have a system where money is breaking down, where money is losing its purchasing power, well, all of a sudden, it's not about us and our collective benefit of trying to give back to society. It's, I need to preserve myself so I can last as long as I can. So therefore, I need to extract as much as I can from society. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas when we have money, such as Bitcoin, and it doesn't even necessarily need to increase in purchasing power. If it just stays stationary in purchasing power, all of a sudden you have security moving forward. And if you have security moving forward, then all of a sudden it's not about extractive. It is about, okay, if I want to collaborate with society, I'll have to offer value. And so it's not about trying to build that security for the future because of fear that the money is losing its purchasing power. And so in terms of kind of the second part of your question, which was to do with how does that tie into, I'm trying to remember the exact wording. Give me the exact wording again. It was how does it tie into family life?
Family life. So it's more like the sort of the next step down in terms of the reality of how it impacts us at that family, personal, individual level. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. So I think when it comes to money, people don't necessarily realize that when we have, and I touched on this earlier, when we have a monetary system whereby the central bank is able to devalue the money through the printing of money, what ends up happening is because our purchasing power is worth less over time, then people store their value in assets. Now, if people store their value in assets, then asset prices rise while the currency's purchasing power falls. Now, unfortunately, in society today, the majority of the population live kind of at or just above the poverty line. I think it's a third of the US live below the poverty line, and about half live at or just above the poverty line. So when you've got this large percentage of the population that is struggling to get by, when you have mothers and fathers who traditionally, and I'm talking only 50 years ago, a husband was able to bring in a single earner's wage and be able to afford a house and to be able to put food on the table and support the mum looking after the kids. That was huge. That was amazing. But as time has progressed, and as we've seen more or greater intervention from central banks, we've seen this devaluing of currency, and it becomes harder and harder to get ahead in life. And so because it is harder and harder to get ahead in life, suddenly the single earner household where just the dad is going out and earning can no longer exist. The mother also has to go out and earn. And so if the mother is out earning and the father is out earning, well, then now that's going to have pressure on the relationship with their children. And so that may seem kind of insignificant, but it is huge. And we can touch on this more. And I don't know if you want to add anything to what I just said.
Oh, yeah, let's go down that hole. I'm really happy to go there. So let's talk about, well, I mean, I suppose some of this is now self-evident. So we're saying if there's the opportunity for a parent to be at home with their kids more, the difference in the kind of the psychology of the entire generation and beyond completely upends, or should I say reverses, from what it's been in the last 50 to 70 years, yeah?
100%. And so I think the child-parent relationship is so incredibly important. I think people don't understand the importance of this child-parent relationship. And so basically, if you look at many other animals out there, whether we look at wolves, whether we look at calves, whether we look at baby horses, whatever, those are calves, but whether we look at whatever these animals, foals, whatever animal we look at, these animals usually straight out of the womb are able to walk, usually can do some basic form of hunting, and they can support themselves. When it comes to humans, we are not like that. Because we have developed over time through our evolution, we have developed in a way that basically means that we rely on our parents to support us. And that allows our neural wiring to be able to adapt to many different environments. So that is why humans, we don't just live in cold environments or hot environments, or why we've been able to build skyscrapers, why we've been able to do sports. It's because our neural wiring has allowed us to adapt to whatever it is that we want to adapt to. But that also means that from a young age, that attachment to our parents, what our parents teach us, is so incredibly vital. And so there's a really good quote that I really like from the book, The Developing Mind, by a guy called Daniel Siegel. And he says, for the infant and the young child, attachment relationships are major environmental factors that shape the development of the brain during its period of maximal growth. Attachment establishes an interpersonal relationship that helps the immature brain use the mature functions of the parent's brain to organize its own processes. So kind of diving into that quote is really powerful because it kind of highlights that we need that attachment from our parents. So if our parents are out working, if our parents are not able to be there for us, and instead we look to our peers for attachment, all of a sudden this is going to have repercussions because our parents are what instill values in us. It's what instills morals in us. It allows us to be able to have that kind of anchor point from which we can then explore the world. Whereas our peers, on the other hand, they're usually, especially at a young age, are very superficial relationships. We're looking to, from fear of rejection, we're always looking for likeness. We're looking to be the same as our peers, whether that is through the way we communicate, whether that is how we look, whether that is our mannerisms, the way we think. We're trying to connect with our peers because from fear of rejection through evolution, if we get kicked out of our peer group or a societal group, we're going to die. And so it's really important to be able to find that connection. But unfortunately, that peer connection at a young age during our developmental period is detrimental because it makes us look at the world in a very immature, a very superficial way. So that is why it is so important to have this parental attachment, this parental connection, which unfortunately, with the breakdown of money, is also breaking down our connection to our parents. And this is one of the reasons, and I explore it in an article that I've written called The Solution to Our Downfall in Culture and Authenticity. And I'll explain at the end how to find that. But one of the reasons why we may be experiencing massive increases in mental health and anxiety, and kind of a loss of self, or even people feel alone, is because at the moment, from a young age, they have not had that connection to their parents. And because they have not had that connection to their parents, they have not been able to mature in a way to be able to understand what their own emotions mean, because they've had to mask those emotions to fit in with their peers, which is leading to depression and mental health issues, as I just mentioned.
Yeah, indeed. Wow. Okay, so this is not the stuff we even talk about very much in the Bitcoin community. We're all very used to speaking about the financial system, and we talk about purchasing power and how inflation erodes trust and how it changes values. What we don't talk about is this, which is how it impacts at a deeply personal and generational level. So I find this absolutely fascinating. So I'm just going to try and sum up for anyone who's listening, and I'm sure they've caught it, but really what we're saying is that we've gone from, well, we can go either way with this, but we can say when the government's controlling the levers of money, it leads to erosion of the purchasing power of money. It leads to wealth divide. It means those at the lower end are the most impacted by inflation and having to work, and that breaks apart the family unit and the connection between parent and child. And that leads to, as part of the process, all sorts of mental, I don't know that illness is quite the word, that I think that's pathologizing, but difficulties, challenges, and emotional instability is maybe the better way to say that. Have I captured that?
100%, 100%. And I think that in its most concise form, yeah, you're absolutely spot on. And I think people don't recognize the importance of money. They don't recognize that we just see it as this thing that purchases whatever it is that we want to go and purchase, whether it is a can of Coke, whether it is our food, whether we get a little bit of money from our job. But the reality is that money is kind of the most important foundation of society, because if you start distorting the money, you get knock-on effects in all other areas of the economy.
Yes. And I think I took a while to get my head around this as I started to dive down Bitcoin, because when people talk about money as the foundational level of society, I thought, oh, I don't know that that's the foundational level of society. I would have thought maybe love and family and so forth. But it's a valid point for this reason, because, and I love how Robert Breedlove talks about this as money is time allocation technology. I'm not sure if that's the precise wording, but I put my time into my work and I get paid in currency. And then I choose how to spend my time. That's my time representation, my representation of my time in whichever way I choose. It may be skydiving, or it may be on my family home, or it may be on whatever it is. But it's a representation of what I value. It is a representation of our individual and collective values. Mm-hmm. And that's why money is so foundational to society. And when you get the breakdown of trust and soundness of money, so you get the breakdown in value and values. Mm-hmm. They are one and the same. They are related. And I've struggled to, I think maybe reading that article of yours really helped me clarify that for myself.
Well, and I think you touch on something that is so powerful, and that is the fact that if you, rather than thinking about money as just this exchange of goods and services, think about money as the exchange of value, because value can be anything, whether we value family collective, whether we value food, whether we value sports, whatever it may be. And so if you look through every single species throughout society, throughout history, in order to survive, you have to be building off accurate data. If you're not seeing accurate data, or you're not able to interpret the world around you accurately, you're going to potentially die, or you're going to most likely die at some point. And so in order to survive, you need to be building off accurate data. And so when you distort money, which money is the actual, it's like the lifeblood of society. It is what we value. It is how we exchange value between one another. When you distort money and you stop people from spending into certain areas of the economy, or you restrict like this certain sector of the economy, or you freeze people's bank accounts, when you do all of this kind of stuff, what ends up happening is you're distorting the information which humanity is building off of. And so you're actually impacting society on the whole. You're impacting humanity's chance of survival because we're not building off of a solid ground.
Exactly. That's right. And the implications of that are almost too big to fathom. This episode of Bitcoin People proudly brought to you by Looking Glass Education, bringing you easy to read, beginner-friendly financial education to help you take control of your financial future. And it's all free, so go check it out. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know what part in society we're going back to. Are we going back, like, it's almost like we're going back to, people often talk about going back to the gold standard, or, you know, people relate back to the 50s or prior, at least to 1971, when, you know, gold was separated from, was when we came off the gold standard altogether. But actually, we're going back, in inverted commas, to a time where, or what Bitcoin implies, is now we're peer-to-peer in our transactions, in our value swap. And the government is out of it. So we're back in that sort of community, trustless. It's not about, it's not about trusting government. We can trust each other. We're not
100%. And this is where
each other. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is where, when you are able to separate money from state, all of a sudden, the only way to be able to obtain value in societies is to give value back. And so all of a sudden, you get true, accurate data for what humanity deems is valuable. And so we're starting to build back on an accurate data feed. So it maximizes the chance of humanity surviving. You just got to step back and stop thinking about money as just money. You got to realize that it's a data feed. It's a data feed that is telling us what society values, what is important to society. And so the moment you have someone who's stepping in and saying, well, you can't do that, you can do this, well, this money is worth less, you're distorting that data feed. And this data feed is vital for survival.
It's so huge, and the snowball and the, you know, the ripple effect is unfathomable. How hopeful are you?
It's a tough one. Sometimes you get asked the question, do you think it is possible that we can change the current system? And how hopeful are you? And I think the thing that's really challenging is, I think if Bitcoin, and to be honest, I should actually just say quickly, it is not about Bitcoin, it is about what Bitcoin does. And so I think a lot of people sometimes get sucked into the community aspect of Bitcoin, but then we're just kind of creating a religion. And so I think the key is to step back sometimes from just the community aspect of Bitcoin and realize, well, what is it that Bitcoin is doing to society, and why am I supporting Bitcoin? Because you need to be able to recognize that if something was to permanently impact Bitcoin, or if there was something new to come along that was to be able to supersede Bitcoin, again, it's not about Bitcoin. It's, I'm going to do what we can to be able to maximize the chance of humanity for the survival of humanity. And so I think when it comes to how hopeful I am, I believe that if Bitcoin, or the trend that Bitcoin is kind of taking us in, continues, I think I'm incredibly hopeful, because I think all of a sudden it means that we are going to realign our incentive structure in society, which is absolutely massive. But the problem is, our current system, and people have probably heard about this in many other podcasts, whether it's reading about finance, whether it is documentaries, they've probably heard that we have a massive debt burden right now. And because of the debt burden, when this new system, if it does kind of materialize, when this new system kind of materializes and starts to dominate, unfortunately, the previous system has to unwind. And when it unwinds with the amount of debt that we have, unfortunately, it's going to be quite catastrophic. And we're going to have to suffer pain. But we're going to have to suffer pain because when we borrow, we're borrowing from the future. And so all of this debt that we've consumed, we've got to pay back that debt. We've got to figure out a way to at least find that homeostasis again, where society is operating from a place of values and not from a place of what do we need to do to minimize the burden of debt just to be able to support the current existence of this current system. And so that's why in the short term, I think it's going to be painful, but in the long term, I'm hopeful.
Modern monetary theorists would say we don't have to pay back the debt. And just keep spending, just keep printing, just keep spending. My hairdresser literally says that. That's her. She goes, well, why don't we just print more money? Why don't we just create more debt? Why is it a problem?
So this goes back to, like, if the government genuinely had a printer and they can print as much money as they wanted and that would fix our issues, then they could put all of us in mansions, we could all have private jets. But the reality is that although money may not be scarce, all of our resources on this planet are scarce. And so because there is only a finite amount of resources, it doesn't matter how much paper money you print, people are going to, the cost of those resources is going to rise because they're finite. And so this kind of goes back to the whole values thing. When you print more money and you devalue the currency, it creates knock-on effects. And one of those is parents have to go out and both work to be able to support the family. Both parents have to spend time in the workplace to be able to put food on the table, to be able to afford a roof over their heads. And this is breaking down that parental or the parent-child relationship. And with a breakdown of the parent-child relationship, we start to see knock-on effects. And so we're only just starting to see these effects over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 plus years. And I think that if we had to fast forward 100 years, if this system continues, I think it's going to be disastrous for mental health and just health in general, not just mental health. We're already starting to see massive rates of obesity, and a lot of individuals, such as like Gabor Mate, who talk a lot about the psychology of illness. They look at whether it's obesity, whether it is many other illnesses, whether it's even cancer. A lot of this stems from our own trauma. And if that trauma is to do with our parent-child relationship, which shows you how vital that relationship is. And so we don't want to destroy that through money.
I had I always, and I've brought it up in a few podcasts, I often play with this idea of nature versus nurture. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And I've also got some thoughts that are outside of the traditional kind of ideas around nature versus nurture. But anyway, leaving that aside, and I'm pivoting now. I'm pivoting away from Bitcoin and I'm going deeper into the kind of just philosophy and psychology. You're very strong on, you've obviously given a lot of thought to trauma, the trauma of being separated from good nurturing at home, having that parental connection and stability. What's taken you, you're only a young gentleman, you have thought a lot about money and the connection of money to family and psychology and so forth. I have a slightly different take from you on nature versus nurture. I think you head a little bit more towards the nurture side, the environment side, whereas I tend towards a little bit more in the way of genetics and nature. Can you expand on that for me? Why you feel it's more about nurture, it's more about environment and the impact of that on human beings?
For sure. So when we look at, again, the nature versus nurture, for people that are kind of unfamiliar, when we look at our genetics, many people believe from the moment we are born, we are who we are because of the genetics that we carry, and that is fixed. Whereas the nurture argument is that when we come into this environment, we are very malleable and we can change based on environmental circumstances. And it's really important to kind of point out that there's no right or wrong. It's not one or the other. There is certain tendencies whereby, yes, we can be born with certain diseases that are solely genetic. We cannot change that. From the moment we're born, we cannot change that. But at the same time, there is many people that have been able to change such unbelievable things purely from their environment that it makes you then start to question, well, how far does this pendulum swing? Are we very much fixed in our genetics, or does it change? And that's where the study of epigenetics comes in. And so epigenetics is looking at how our genetics are impacted by our environment and how certain genes can be turned on or off. And so the example that I like to give is when you look at someone who has got ADHD or even autism. In both situations, there are no genetic tags that scientists have yet to discover that point to this is the tag for autism, this is the tag for genetics. Sorry, this is a tag for ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
So you can start to theorize, well, why does this come about? And one of the reasons, and Gabor Mate in his book Scattered Minds, he talks about this in relation to ADHD. And it's fascinating because I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid. And so one of the things he talks about is, as a kid, when we are put in an uncomfortable situation, we have three responses. We can either fight back, which we're not going, if we're like 3 years old, how are we going to fight back our parents? We're not going to. Mm-hmm. We can flight, we can run away. Well, again, if we're 3 years old, we can't go far. We're stuck inside the house. And so the final one is fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the time we freeze in this discomfort and our mind learns to disconnect. Our mind disconnects because that brings a sense of comfort. It removes that unpleasant feeling that we were feeling. And so whenever we find ourselves in unpleasant situations, what happens? Our mind learns to disconnect. And so it is his belief, as well as many others, that ADHD comes about, again, not from our genetics, but rather our experience as a child when we encountered feelings of uncomfortableness. If we were not able to run away, if we were not able to fight back, we learned to disconnect. And so now when we're in the classroom and all of a sudden the teacher starts saying something that we don't understand, we feel uncomfortable and our mind disconnects. And so this is where ADHD, I believe, comes about from this nature side of things. It's our environment that we grew up in. And it's the same thing. Another example would be depression. And we touch on this, or I touch on this in the article, which is where a lot of people think depression is genetic. Depression is not genetic. From the moment we're born, we learn how to express emotions. And so what is depression? Well, simply put, depression, as given away in the name, is the depress of feelings. And so why would people be depressing feelings? Well, it's because they don't know they're there. And so as a kid, if we're brought into a family and when we are uncomfortable, when we feel upset, when we feel frustrated, if our parents weren't there to comfort us, or if our parents weren't there to engage with us, then what happens is we learn to depress those feelings. We don't want to feel those, so we learn to depress them. And this carries through to adulthood, whereby when we feel uncomfortable, we don't know how to communicate or express ourselves. And so it shows itself in the form of depression, or it can even show itself in the form of illness. And so I tend to lean on, if I was to kind of put it on a spectrum, I would say we're kind of more heavily leaning towards like 3/4 towards the nature versus the nurture argument, because I believe that as we change our environment around us, we can very much change our genetics.
Lovely explanation. And yes, I've read and heard a bit about epigenetics. Gee, I can't say that word either along the way too. I must be having, and it's only 10 o'clock in the morning. I haven't even had a glass of wine, you know. You give away a little bit about your personal background in that article and your own childhood experiences, which I'm not going to deep dive into here because people can kind of explore that in the article, and of course we'll link to that below. You've obviously done a lot of study to come to terms with your own personal background and to understand its impact. What do you do to, I'm going to say, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, to support yourself and to heal yourself and to realize your personal potential going forward from the difficult experiences of your own background?
I would say that's a big question. I would say that in life, finding the balance. So a long time ago, actually, I have to step back. A long time ago, I went through a really tough breakup, and I went to a therapist. And this therapist, he treats, living here in Whistler, where I live in British Columbia, we have probably the highest concentration of Olympians and world-class athletes in the world. And so he treats a lot of these Olympians and world-class athletes. And these individuals, what he noticed is they would spend their whole life competing for this one thing, whether it's like a gold medal in snowboarding or whatever you want to say. They would spend their whole life competing for this one thing. And the moment that one thing falls down or breaks down, they lose that sense of self because their self-identity had revolved around this gold medal or this sport. And so I think that it's so important in life to step away from our doingness, and that is what we do in life, our activities, our sports, and more focus on who we are and building a sense of like, what are my values in life, and being diversified in where we spend our time. And so I think it's really important to have creative endeavors. I think it's really important to have physical endeavors, whether that's sports or activities of any sort. And then it's also really good to have spiritual endeavors so that we can start to think bigger than ourselves and dive into the realms of philosophy and things like that. And so I think having that balance and having a multitude of kind of supports in our foundation just helps balance us as individuals. And it also means that when we take an impact, whether it's a tough breakup, whether a sport that we enjoy is not working out, whether a career that we dedicated our time to is not kind of maybe the one that we end up going down, it doesn't break down who we are as individuals. And so when it comes to kind of me as an individual, I very much believe in kind of following my passions. And so whenever anything intrigues me or whether anything excites me, I dive headfirst into it. And that's part of my ADHD. I get hyper focused on things, but I dive headfirst into the things that kind of resonate with me. And I find it interesting that as I get older and you start to build out this more broad knowledge base, you start to see connections between all of these different knowledge bases. And that's where initially when I started diving into Bitcoin, I would never in a million years have connected Bitcoin to trauma and the impact of the family, like parent-child bond. And so as you start kind of delving into things that excite you, you start to realize there's so many intricate connections between them, and it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So I just think it's so important to balance, as you mentioned, the sport aspect, the physical aspect, the mental, the spiritual, and the creative. I think it's so important.
What does spirituality mean to you, and what do you, if I'm going to use the word practice or around, what is that for you, if anything?
So I was baptized as a kid, and my dad was Christian, but I would say that I am not, for the longest time, I would have said that I was agnostic. I would say that I don't necessarily believe in anything, but I'm open to if someone was to show me something. But over the last 5 years, 5 to 8 years, I've gone deep down the rabbit hole of more spirituality away from religion and kind of just finding our innate selves, and the fact that on an energetic level, I truly believe that we are connected with one another. On an energetic level, I think that we can tap into such profound depths of knowledge. And that is where most of you guys have probably had that experience where at night, you wake up in the middle of the night or you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden an answer comes to you from something that you weren't consciously thinking about. And this is where I think we're tapping into something deeper here. So I very much believe in kind of the spiritual realm, that there is something bigger than us. And I very much believe in kind of there's a bigger, more holistic connectedness than just we as just this entity that kind of comes into this world and passes away. So I believe in the soul. I believe in kind of the spirit world. I believe in reincarnation, all of these things, because I think it's fascinating. And when you start diving into this stuff, the evidence there's a lot of evidence there. There's a lot of things to support it as well.
I suspect that you and I are quite aligned on some of these things and could go deep down a very different rabbit hole here. One of the things that's made me, that I really think about with Bitcoin is that, again, Breedlove has got a whole series around Bitcoin and zero, the number zero. But it didn't go quite where I expected it to go, because I think there's something essential essence around Bitcoin. Well, I suppose because it's ethereal, or as Knut Svanholm might call it, it's like element zero. And so to me, that's tapping into something that is consciousness, that's that spirituality, that's that energy, that life force, whatever you want to call it. So to me, Bitcoin is springing from something deeply, essentially truthful in humanity. And you explore this a little bit in your thoughts about Satoshi Nakamoto in your article. I'm feeling like, I know we're heading towards the 1 hour mark, but I would actually like you, if you were to imagine who Satoshi might be and where this whole concept came from, and you can tie in spirituality or humanity or trauma, or I don't really care where you go. Like, what are your thoughts about who this person or people might be?
You know what? Like, there's, oh man, I'm trying to remember the name of it. There's a TV series, there's a documentary little series on YouTube that explores like who is Satoshi. And it's definitely more of just like a practical, rational thinking who is Satoshi. It just kind of goes through, well,
and
given that his
is that the
handwriting
one where
was
they
this.
kind of eliminate, it could have been one of these 4 or 5 people, and then they...
Yeah, and it goes all the way down, and it points to someone that I very much have a belief that he is Satoshi. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't believe that, and maybe this is just me being cynical, I don't believe Satoshi realized the full extent of what Bitcoin could do. Like it truly blows my mind when you start reading how Finney and Satoshi's communication back and forth, and you start recognizing that they were thinking about the stuff that we are talking about now and the implications that Bitcoin has before this thing had even came about. But on a spiritual, bigger, deeper level, or when it comes to trauma, I don't think that they could have possibly understood the depth at which changing the monetary system could have, because from Satoshi's writing, I believe he was looking more for a way to be able to interact with one another cryptographically and privately. And I think that is so incredibly powerful. But I wonder if he had ever thought that this would be something that the whole world would potentially be interacting with, the whole world could build from. And with that in mind, I think it's hard to envision the possibilities of that. And that's where I think as Bitcoin has evolved and we've started to see all of these incredible minds, whether it is Breedlove, whether it is Saifedean, whether it is any of these individuals that have written these unbelievable books, what you start to see is people from their own unique backgrounds starting to bring their insight into how Bitcoin connects with that dynamic or that area or that sector of the economy. And so I think that as Bitcoin evolves and as Bitcoin continues to grow in adoption, I think we're only going to see other areas of society which it touches. And it's my belief that I think because money is the foundation of everything in society, it's my belief that Bitcoin essentially touches every area of society. And I think it has the potential to improve humanity on a vast scale. Because if we can realign our incentive structures that we talked about at the start, if we can help people to see a bigger picture rather than just look to try and support themselves in the short term because money is deteriorating, all of a sudden, I think the benefits and the knock-on effects are going to be huge.
Mic drop. That's feeling like a fabulous note to potentially finish up on. Are there any final thoughts, final words, anything that you feel we haven't touched on that you would like to say as a final note?
You know what? I would just like tying into what we just talked about then. I think it's so important because Bitcoin is its own entity. It has no marketing department. It has no people that are being paid to support Bitcoin. The reality is we are, as the individuals, you as a podcast host, me as a writer, the Looking Glass is an educational platform. It is our responsibility to be the marketers of Bitcoin. And that's where no matter who you are or your background, you will read stuff about Bitcoin that you agree with, disagree with, or you have new insights. And I think it's so important to share that. And even if you may feel like imposter syndrome because you're not a financial expert, whatever your background is, I think sharing your experiences and the ideas that come to you is so powerful because it helps connect humanity and also starts to help us look at Bitcoin from different perspectives and under a different light. I think no matter what your background is, joining or like jumping into the community head first and integrating and collaborating with the community is so profound and important. So I just want to say, yeah, don't be scared of creating content, even if you're not the professional economist or whatever that you believe you should be.
Oh, that's actually great to hear and reassuring for me personally, actually. So fantastic. Seb, if people want to follow you, look you up, where should they be looking?
Yeah, so we have a platform called Looking Glass Education, and that can just be found at lookingglasseducation.com. And that is it's basically macroeconomic, financial, Bitcoin education and distilling it down for the average person and the layman. And I believe that is so important because in our world today, there's so much content out there if you want to dive deep into things, but there's not enough content for the individual who is not super familiar with Bitcoin or what it means to the world or how our macroeconomic backdrop has brought us to where we are today with the debt burden and the financial issues we're facing. And then finally, I also started a few months ago I started a newsletter called The Chi of Self-Sovereignty. And it's just a free weekly newsletter because I felt as if I love writing about Bitcoin, but I felt stunted in my ability to write solely about Bitcoin. And so I ended up expanding it to sovereignty. And so it's a free weekly newsletter, and I touch on different subjects surrounding sovereignty. And I love it, absolutely love it, because that's where I can dive into trauma, and that's where I can dive into spirituality, and that's where I can dive into the things that an education platform maybe it's not designed for. Oh, and you can find that.
We might need a branch. You might need a branch of the education platform. Just
100%. Yeah. And you can. I was just going to say you can find that at Seb Bunney, which is SEBBUNNEY.com. For the newsletter. Beautiful.
Absolutely fantastic. Seb, what a pleasure to finally meet you and chat with you person to person. Thank you for taking the time to do this. Cold and dark as it is over there in Canada at the moment, whilst I'm in bright, sunshiny, warm Sydney. I don't want to make you jealous or anything. I look forward to the day when we get to meet in person. Till then, be well, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carrie. I really appreciate it. What you're doing is phenomenal. And as I mentioned, everyone has got their own unique voice. And so creating a podcast and being able to communicate with individuals and your ability to present is just mind-blowing. So you're definitely valuable to the space.
Thanks, Seb. All the best. Take care. Ciao for now.
See ya.
Bye. This episode of Bitcoin People brought to you by F2F Communications, helping you with your pitches, your presentations, your conferences, and your day in and day out business communications.